All right. And we are recording. So it looks like everything's set up. Thanks everyone that's coming in and joining us today. Looking right now to see, it looks like we have 23 people in. We're at the top of the hour, so we'll wait just a few more seconds. And I will put up the slides for introduction. Cool. All right. Hey, everyone. Thanks for joining today. We have a great roundtable discussion, which I'm excited about, on navigating the challenges of enterprise vulnerability management. This webinar is part of an ongoing effort to educate cybersecurity practitioners and leaders on vulnerability management. Well, always some of my favorite topics. My name is Patrick Garrity, security researcher and VP marketing here at Nucleus Security. And I'm looking forward to hosting today's discussion with some great panelists, and they'll touch on their different expertise with vulnerability management, incident response, and a bunch of other stuff related to security. We only have an hour, and my goal is to make this session valuable for enterprise vulnerability management teams and security teams. We have both Zoom as well as LinkedIn, and you can interact with us during this session. I'd highlight there's the Q&A button. The chat is open as well. So in order to get started, I think I'd love to hear in the comments the biggest vulnerability management challenges you have today. We can try and interlace that into our conversation. Or if you're not comfortable doing that, drop an emoji or a note to say hi to all of us into the chat box. So now we'll get started and we're ready to meet our panelists. So very exciting today. Joining me is a group of vulnerability management practitioners and researchers, which hosts the Cyber Resilience podcast. Two great people that I really enjoy collaborating with. First up, we have Nikki Robinson, and Nikki works at IBM Security. Got to keep my slides up as I go, and wrote Mind the Security Gap book, which is great and talks about the challenges of IT and security teams face after spending 15 years working in both IT operations and security. And you recently won the Cyber Women Influencer of the Year award. I think it was given out at Black Hat. So thanks for joining us today, Nikki.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Patrick. And this is my favorite topic, so I'm excited to be here.
Awesome, great. Well, thanks for coming on. Next, we have Chris Hughes, president of Acquia and CISA fellow at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. Chris wrote the book on software transparency with our other friend, Tony Turner, which is great, and has focused on cloud cybersecurity for 20 plus years. And, I get to collaborate. I think some of your articles you incorporate my images on, so that makes me pretty happy, and it's great to get feedback and kind of learn as well. So just want to highlight that. Chris, welcome to the discussion today.
Yeah, definitely. I'm excited to be here, and I appreciate those visualizations because I talk a lot, so and write a lot. So you can say in an image what it takes me, a 20-minute article to get across. So I appreciate it.
Cool. And then the other thing I want to highlight today is just you two are writing a book together on modern vulnerability management, and I'll talk about that later too. But it is available for pre-order on Amazon. So I'm curious, before we hop in, like what inspired you guys to come together and write a book?
So I'm curious from Nikki's perspective. I'll see what she says. But for me, I was writing the book on software supply chain security. And as part of that, obviously doing a deep dive into vulnerability management as a piece of that, and I realized like, wow, our ecosystem is just broken. I had been doing vulnerability management for a long time, but I never really stopped to ask questions on like why we do certain things the way we do them, or, how things are kind of how we come about doing things a certain way. And as I did, I was just really, kind of dumbfounded by how broken everything is. So I asked her, hey, I know you focus on this area. It would be awesome to write a book together. And here we are.
Yeah, it was funny because I think we sort of had the same idea at the same time. I'd written Mind the Tech Gap, and vulnerability management is definitely my area of expertise. It's the entire reason I got into cybersecurity was because I was doing vulnerability management from the IT side, and coming to the cybersecurity side, I just was like, how can I make this easier for all the people that have to be boots on the ground, the people that are actually doing this work? How can I make their lives easier? And so Chris and I started talking, and I was like, I would love to write another book and really focus in on this area, and hopefully, build some great guidance and help for people that want to mature their vulnerability management programs.
That's great. So it sounds like you both have mutual passion on the topic and great perspectives to share with others. So yeah, thanks for joining. I'm looking forward to the book coming out. I know I've read a good portion of both your books. I'm not going to claim to have read them end to end, but they're very, very thought out, full of amazing content to learn on different topics, some of which we're going to discuss today. So, the first thing I wanted to hop into is the human element in regards to vulnerability management. And how do you emphasize the importance of the human element in the process of vulnerability management, especially with the increasing automation in cybersecurity?
Yeah, I'm going to hop right in on this one. So this is totally, I think, one of the areas that we don't talk enough about, which is, another one of the reasons why we wanted to write this book too, right? Is talking about the people who manage the vulnerabilities, right? Even if you automate some patch management, some secure configuration, I always use Active Directory group policy as a great example of that for secure config. But there's always going to have to be a person, managing those, doing continuous monitoring, someone who needs to really own that process. And so automation is great. I think it can help people really focus on what's important, right? Determining where anomalies, hey, this configuration was there yesterday, why is it not there today? People that can sort of put that discerning eye into the vulnerability management process, but having someone who really understands the systems in depth, I think that it's really crucial to a really successful vulnerability management program. And then, of course, someone who can help augment those processes with some automation and tooling or scripting or whatever they have available to them.
Yeah, I'll just add on that, as a practitioner who's done vulnerability management for quite a while, for all the hype of AI and automation and shift left and CI/CD tooling and all those things, at the end of the day, it's still people who have context of the organization, its mission or business, functions, the system, architecture and design. And obviously these tools are not infallible too. We have plenty of false positives, false negatives, a lot of dialogue that has to go on between the teams. And I think that, anyone who's been in this function knows that, dealing with the humans is absolutely critical to making an impact, of driving down organizations' vulnerabilities and doing it in a healthy way. It doesn't kind of bolster silos between the teams because they just aren't talking to each other, talking past each other, and have misaligned incentives.
Yeah, it's rather interesting. Like, I think sometimes people jump to automation immediately to try and be like, hey, is there a silver bullet that can just solve the problem and not require more people? And I think they overlook analyzing the true aspect of the problem, right? Like root cause analysis type of things, looking at alignment within an organization, as you kind of highlighted, which is great. So I'm curious, and I think like there was some of this, Nikki, in your book. Can you share an experience where the human context greatly impacted the decision-making process in vulnerability management? I know that's a curveball one, but curious if you have any good examples.
I do. And this is actually a very a good story for why I wanted to pursue a doctorate and do research, because I felt like there wasn't enough really good documentation and research out there that sort of helped back up what I was saying, at the time. So vulnerability chaining, hands down, that to me is like one of those big examples. So vulnerabilities that are scored by CVSS, and this is years and years ago, but they can be scored as low and medium, but they could still be highly exploitable. And this was before EPSS and KEV and all those other tools that we have now. But at the time, I was trying to fight for remediation of low and medium vulnerabilities. And I kept getting that's why do I care about those? I got to focus on the criticals and highs, right? And without human intervention to say, hey, I know these are scored as low and medium, but they're also highly exploitable. And if they're on external facing systems or something like that, and I'm more concerned with them, So I think, without that human interaction, that those low and mediums might still sit, unremediated. So that I think that's probably my best example of having human interaction with the vulnerability management program can help steer prioritization and remediation.
Yeah, and then from my perspective, I can't think of an example when I've done vulnerability management where there wasn't human context required, whether it was like reporting to leadership on burning down vulnerability backlogs or prioritization with the engineering and development teams in terms of, what systems and vulnerability should be prioritized or what systems can't be disrupted for some, specific business purpose, and honestly diving into vulnerabilities to see, is something actually exploitable? Should we actually be concerned with it? Is it false positive? It's always involved human interaction. And as you point out, like, obviously as a society, we always look for a silver bullet, whether, weight loss or financially or vulnerability management, we all want a shortcut, but unfortunately you got to do the hard work of getting in there and having a conversation with other people.
Yeah, you got to do the work. I think that's a good point to point out. The weight loss analogy is kind of comical because, I think it is very, vulnerability management is very indicative of people trying to just do the simplest thing possible, thinking it's going to make impact, and it takes a lot of effort and a lot of work. In that regard, one of the slides you guys both talked at Carnegie Mellon, I think it was last week, and I think some of this also has pulled the image, I think, from your blog. But as we're talking about the human element in alignment, right? Alignment is a big part within an organization. And I'm curious to hear, what challenges you guys have faced in aligning different departments around vulnerability management objectives.
Yeah, I'll give a little context to this slide. This was one of my slides. For all the talk in the industry, like I said in the slide here of DevSecOps and breaking down silos and everyone coming together and singing Kumbaya and holding hands around the fireside, the behavior of security has actually bolstered silos. We simply just dump massive lists of vulnerabilities on our engineering and development peers and tell them, hey, you got to do XYZ, or you can't go to production, or you need to do this, or we're going to report this to leadership, or it's always kind of punitive behavior that we kind of associate towards our engineering and development peers. And we do it without providing context. Like we've shifted left, SAS, DAS, infrastructure as code scanning, SCA, throw the acronym soup in there, and we're producing more and more findings with no context around exploitability, no exploitation, business criticality, sensitive data sensitivity, etc. So that's what I was trying to get across in this slide here is like the importance of providing that context, to our peers, because if we don't, they don't want to engage with us. They kind of avoid us at all costs. They see us as a hassle. So if we can get in there and have that rapport with them, build those relationships, we can have better vulnerability management outcomes and actually drive down risk for the enterprise.
I'm disappointed you don't have CSPM on here.
That's coming up. Actually, it's not coming up, but in the deck that we had here, I had a slide on and there's CNAP, CWPP, CSPMs, SSPM. Like we just have acronym soup, and that doesn't help with our peers either.
No, it's great, and I think the context of what you're talking about, right? It's like, especially in traditional vulnerability management, like even understanding the software development lifecycle. In that how a vulnerability presents itself in software is completely different than upgrading a Windows server or patching a Cisco network device. And I think that's, next month we have a webinar on product security specifically, but like, I think that's a big part of the problem is like people are in different roles and just don't understand the context of all these different things. And, kind of throwing those vulnerabilities over the fence as you highlight here.
Yeah, I put actually this was one of the reasons why I wrote Mind the Tech Gap, because I found that, because I was on the IT ops side and I'm on the security side in different roles. And what I found is working with whether it's developers, engineers, infrastructure architects, or network engineers, we all sort of speak a different language and everyone has different goals, right? Like everyone has a different mission. My mission is remediate vulnerabilities, right? Like that's my job, is to reduce risk overall. But someone else's goal is, hey, we have a product that needs to go live in 2 weeks, or we have a cycle, a sprint cycle that ends this Friday, and we've got to do X, Y, and Z. We already have planned for this cycle. And so it's like, if you can't, sort of understand where they're at, and really get an idea of what is possible. Like Chris alluded to, if you just like throw over a 300-page vulnerability report and you're like, hey guys, good luck. I hope you enjoy this report. And by the way, you have 30 days to fix it. It becomes a, hey, go do this thing versus a collaborative effort where you can say, okay, let me understand what you've got going on. Let's figure out how we can do this and what makes the most sense for everybody involved.
Yeah, I want to jump back in real quick if I could, because I realized I went on a little bit of a rant about my slide and totally missed your question about the incentive piece. And it comes back to the human element again. In security, we like to think that, the whole world revolves around security. Everyone's thinking and talking about security all the time. It's the only thing that matters. But really, engineers, developers, they're incentivized and measured in terms of performance on, feature development, product backlog, releases, getting capabilities out to the market, growing market share, all these kind of things that have nothing to do with security in many cases. But we think the world revolves around us. So I think, like in my experience, having empathy and understanding what they're doing, why they're doing it, how their performance is graded, it can really help you understand what's driving their behavior, and then help you kind of align with, what they're trying to do, because most often what they're trying to do has a lot of business value. And we always hear about, security being a blocker. And now there's kind of a growth of, security being a business enabler. If we want to be a business enabler, we have to have that kind of rapport relationship and understand like what people are doing, why, and how it benefits the business. You're on mute.
You're on mute, Patrick.
Sorry, bad setup here. My bad. What I was going to ask was in relation to like people starting, like I think there's an aspect where communication and breakdowns happen, and it's a pretty big issue. But like as a vulnerability management team or a security leader, like where should you even start in relation to fixing the communication problem in regard?
So go ahead, Nikki. He cut out a little bit, but I think I got his question. Go ahead. I'll jump in after you.
Yeah. So I would say when you're just sort of starting out, I think the biggest thing is, right, do a gap analysis, right? Like, where are our biggest problems? Who are we, working well with? Who are we not? And when you're trying to build relationships, usually what I found is, instead of scheduling a meeting and saying, hey, we've got a security assessment and you don't know who I am, but we've got a security assessment, we've got to go into these things, is just make an introduction call. Take 30 minutes, introduce yourself, tell them who you are, what you do, your background, what your interests are, like, and get to know them, right? Like, ask them questions and let them tell you a bit about themselves too, instead of saying, okay, we're going to do the security assessment 4-hour-long meeting and we're going to go through, X, Y, and Z. I think that's the best place to start, because one of the things I've seen just over the years is sometimes when I spend that time introducing myself, people are like, oh, I didn't even know people on the security team. Like, I've never met people on the security team before. And so if you can just take a moment and introduce yourself, and not over email, right? Not over Slack, really spend, like, if you can't get in a room or whatever, get on a webinar or whatever, and actually spend the time to get to know them, because usually that first step will open up a ton of doors and lead you to other people.
Yeah, I guess I agree everything she said there in terms of how to go about doing it. And I think that, just starting to build that trust, that relationship, that communication is critical. And then the, kind of a human element in terms of the workforce is like, it's not always best in my experience to necessarily put your most, adept and technically proficient vulnerability management SME on the conversation, or your sharpest engineer. There's a lot to be said about having someone that has great communication skills and understands what your team's trying to do, what the other team's trying to do, and could be that bridge between the two teams and actually communicate and have those soft skills that sometimes, maybe engineers don't always have in some cases. So having someone on the team with soft skills can go a long way of bridging the gap between the two teams and just helping align the two teams in terms of what they're trying to accomplish and how they can benefit one another.
Cool. Hey, so one of my favorite things is Tony Turner. His comment is to have a pizza party, which is aligned with what you're saying. Like, just sit down with the people and grab lunch, be superhuman, get to know them, get to know their job. Get to know what they do, because I think like that then allows you to understand and have empathy, right? Which is what you were talking about, Nikki. It is kind of interesting. I was talking to a newer vulnerability management analyst recently, and he was frustrated because he was throwing Excel spreadsheets over to a plant saying you have to fix all these vulnerabilities, when in reality, like, the plant did not want to patch them because they can't afford downtime in production, right? When you're making like vehicles. Downtime could be like tens of millions of dollars a day. So it's just really interesting to see, like, until that person spent the time to go to the plant and understand, they were just frustrated that like no one would listen to them or fix the vulnerabilities.
Yeah.
And what they were able to find was like, oh, there's a time window, right, in which the plant was shut down, that then they would be able to fix them. So like they could align more with that part of the business on that.
Yeah, I was going to make a quick comment there is like, we always talk about risk tolerance in the business. And from our perspective, like often you're just looking at the severity of a vulnerability, and that's the risk in your mind. But reality is like there's business operations, there's revenue, there's mission functions that are going on. And as you point out, like sometimes the risk tolerance is like, hey, we can't have disruption. It doesn't matter what severity that vulnerability is, and there has to have that dialogue to kind of get down to those details.
So we got some new, Justin said brisket in the break room. That's great. And then offering food is bipartisan, conflict-free, common ground to build a relationship. So it seems like food's a pretty good option. Take someone to lunch if you have the opportunity to. But hey, everyone, sounds like there's a lot of comments on CVSS and prioritization from a few different people, Sean, Nate, Josh, others, and that's actually one of our next topics that we're going to be talking about. So we're gonna hop into a little bit about vulnerability scoring and prioritization struggles. And it sounds like everyone really wants to hear opinions on CVSS, which I think the comments all reflect reality as well. So curious on the topic of prioritization, given that not all vulnerabilities can be addressed immediately, how do you decide which ones to prioritize?
Yeah, this is another slide of mine from that talk we did recently. And I was just trying to demonstrate the CVE growth, 200,000 plus CVEs, 20,000 in 2023 alone. It's growing, year over year pretty tremendously. And the severity scores, while they're indicative at a first glance of, hey, this is concerning, when you dig into it a little bit more, you see that less than 5% or 5% on average, roughly each year of CVEs or even overall historically are ever known to be exploited. So while it may be a high or it may be a critical, if it's not actually being exploited in the wild, is it really that critical to you as a business? And that's what I was trying to get across here by leveraging this image from Qualis's true risk report that they put out recently. So organizations like, we always talk about workforce challenges around tech and retainment and et cetera and prioritization. If you have people chasing down, massive lists of vulnerabilities that aren't known to be exploited, you're wasting tremendous time, energy, and resources as an organization. And I don't want to beat up on CVSS too much. I think it's kind of served its function of what it was originally. There wasn't really a broadly used severity scoring system or vulnerability prioritization scoring system in place until CVSS. That doesn't mean we shouldn't iterate and improve and maybe move to something better like EPSS and things like that, which I know we're going to talk about. But just to say that it was great for the time because we had nothing better, but we're starting to see that, hey, maybe this is a flawed approach, or maybe it should just be one of several signals that we take into consideration when we talk about prioritization.
Yeah, I wanted to add, for me, so I spent a lot of my research on vulnerability scoring, right? Like, how do we actually score the vulnerabilities? What do all the metrics mean? How do we do that, right? I think CVSS is a great tool to start with. We have to have some kind of baseline, right? Without CVSS, we have no idea at all, right? It's just like, hey, we've got this whole bucket of vulnerabilities and, we don't know where to start. I do think we have some great tools to help us leverage CVSS in a better way. So we have things like EPSS, the KEV, so we can help, and there's more coming, right? Like there's more tools to help with prioritization. So I think the idea is, vulnerability prioritization is really a unique process to the organization. Every organization is going to have their own specific requirements. Like I think about, like a healthcare system versus a school. They're going to have very different priorities, right? Maybe they're worried about student records or administration versus a hospital is going to be very concerned with potentially ransomware or things like that, like getting into specific medical records, protecting different types of data. And so I think if we start to see vulnerability prioritization as a very unique activity, there's a lot of great tools to help you sort of get a baseline. And then you have to build that vulnerability management. I know we're going to talk about this too, but build that vulnerability management program, maturity model that you can help continue to grow and improve prioritization over time. I think the idea is get started with something, right? So you can sort of figure out what you've got, and then you can build and iterate over time.
Yeah, I want to make a quick
Great.
comment real quick, Patrick, if I can. There was a couple comments in the chat here. It says, from Nate and Mara saying that basically CVSS isn't broken, vendors' implementation of it is broken. And the reason I wanted to call that out is yes, I think the vendors obviously play a part in terms of how they categorize things. But as Nikki points out, it's organizational context in many cases that's missing. And we look at CVSS, it does allow for things like temporal scoring or environmental scoring that you can really narrow down the scoring to your specific environment and your use case, your environment, for example. But the problem is that takes time and energy and resources. If I have, 1.1 million vulnerabilities in my backlog, it's a little difficult to go through and actually, develop an environmental score for each single vulnerability that may be applicable to me. So it's just a lack of time and resources in some case that allow us to maximize the value of CVSS. And that's why things like EPSS and CAV and so on are, a little bit more powerful at a first glance, just to kind of use as a quick effort to prioritize things.
Yeah, hey, and I'm gonna pile on here on the CVSS side as well, because I think what Nate Sanders and some other ones, we're going back and forth, but for those of you not familiar with CVSS or some of the aspects, and I can speak to it from a vendor perspective, right, is, CVSS base scoring is non-enriched. The score you get out of CVSS, which using that on its own has its deficiencies, right? I think 50+% of vulnerabilities are critical or high. It has additional scoring capabilities with temporal scoring and environmental. Historically speaking, vendors did not implement the ability to enrich that in their VM tools. So that is part of the problem. I think CVSS is adapting and changing the temporal score to a new threat system that will make that much, much easier and much more understood, because part of the problem is the definition of these things doesn't map well to things like threat intelligence. So I do think with the CVSS version 4 coming out, there's a lot more promise for vendors like ourselves to actually auto-enrich some of the stuff, including business context as well, that frankly, I think the scoring system of what it has been in the past has been difficult. Nor have vendors prioritized that for a lot of different reasons. So I'm pretty bullish in what Nate is saying in relation to vendor adoption of CVSS version 4 and auto-enriching could make it, it could make it into a universal risk score. If enriched properly with the environmental and threat metrics. But that's my soapbox on CVSS. I think it's great. Everyone's having these discussions. But yeah, if you're just using the base scoring alone, you're gonna have its challenges because you're not focused on real threats. And that's where threat intelligence, EPSS, and some of the other standards really help out. Cool. Sorry, I was on my soapbox, so I gotta get back on topic. We talked about prioritization, which is great. So now we're going to talk a little bit about building an enterprise VM program and what a modern vulnerability management program looks like for an enterprise. So I'm curious. We have a slide here that I can pop up, but I'd love to hear your perspectives on what steps people should take to build a modern enterprise vulnerability management program.
Yeah, so this was one of my slides, and this is I think one of the biggest points that I take away from a vulnerability management program, right, is that especially if you're starting at sort of zero, or you're saying, hey, we've got a massive backlog of vulnerabilities and we're not really sure what to do, we don't know what to do from here. I outlined a few steps that I recommend taking, because to me, the first step is really problem statement creation. It's one of those things that we take from the scientific method, and I think is so applicable here, where, build your problem statement. What do you actually have, right? Do you have 10,000 vulnerabilities in the backlog? Is that really the biggest concern? Is the concern that you've had multiple incidents with web applications? Is it that there's a ton of misconfiguration in the environment? So without doing that first problem statement determination, you can't really sort of figure out what you need to do next. So I always recommend build your problem statement, right? Maybe the problem is that we have a lack of resources who are skilled in vulnerability management to manage and remediate this backlog of vulnerabilities. That might be the problem statement. From there, then you can say, okay, maybe we don't have the skill set. Maybe we need to hire someone. Maybe we need a consultant, sort of take that approach. And then you can say, okay, does my vulnerability management problem statement exist in a silo? Does it exist with one product? Is it an organizational issue? Is it, take it and figure out the scope, right? What is the scope of the problem set? And then from there, I always recommend leverage what automation you can. It can be as simple as a PowerShell script. It can be leveraging Ansible. It can be, using something that you already have in your environment to implement some automation. It doesn't have to be a fully automated solution. Start small. Can we automate reboots based on our maintenance window? Do we have a maintenance window? No, we probably should have one. So like sort of starting from there, and then accounting for the human element, which we've already discussed. How does the human element actually impact the potential risk of these vulnerabilities? Is it the skill set issue? Is it our users or developers, don't have the vulnerability management experience or understand? And then from there, evaluate the backlog of your vulnerabilities for context. So not just we have 10,000 vulnerabilities. How many are highly exploitable? Do we have any on the CISA KEV? Are they on externally facing assets? And sort of go from there. But the biggest thing is I don't want it's fighting through that decision paralysis. That to me is like it can feel very overwhelming to have maybe numerous vulnerabilities or not really quite sure where to start. So avoid the decision paralysis, pick somewhere and just get started. Yeah, exactly. Start small, pick something that makes sense, right? You say, hey, I've got 5 web app servers that I'm concerned with. I'm going to focus on those first. Great. Take care of that, start automating, build from there. And then you can work your way out into, the larger program. But those are definitely my initial recommendations.
Hey, I think similarly, and that's why I fell in love with the KEV, right? Is like the government's trying to do the same thing. Like the KEV is a small list of things where it's like, go fix all of them that are external. Like pretty good place to start, but very, very small. Then take something like EPSS. And I think the asset context is important. I'm talking about externally facing assets, but then you can look more and more at what assets are critical that aren't externally facing even as well. And I think people miss that point is they try and boil the ocean a lot of times. And I don't know the saying, they miss the forest from the woods or trees from the forest.
Miss the forest through the trees.
Yeah. Yep,
I think so. I don't know.
Yeah. So I think that's great from an approach perspective of where people can start and where to focus. Someone asked if we have millions of vulns in multiple departments and owners in large organizations, what are best practices to these owners to fix? And I have some context here as it relates to what we do, because that's almost the identical problem. Excel, Power BI, and access to VM tools. Please suggest what are the best practices. So any thoughts as far as really large scale vuln environments?
Yeah, I'm curious to hear your approach, because this is, kind of essentially what you all do as a vulnerability management vendor. But from my experience, you need an enterprise grade vulnerability management tool that you can actually grant access to the appropriate asset owners, tag assets so they know who they belong to, and then empower folks to see, what vulnerabilities apply to their assets, help them prioritize accordingly, and then actually empower them to go about remediating them. They have the most system and organizational context for the systems that they're responsible for. So have that dialogue with them and then work with them to help burn down those vulnerability backlogs and help them get into a better posture. But I'm curious, Nikki's thoughts, and also Patrick, how you guys tackle that when you start to engage a large enterprise.
Yeah, I think for me, it's got to be the alignment with process too. There should be some agreed upon, hey, this is how we're going to tackle this as an organization, to align with the tooling and the people who are going to be responsible. Because the other thing I think that's important is, do people understand their area of responsibility? Do they know that they're responsible for patching, for mitigating controls, for whatever it might be? Do they know that that's in their in what they should be doing as part of their daily job? Because I think that's just as important. If people don't know what they're responsible for, it can be really difficult to say, okay, well, you've got to patch criticals and highs within 30 days. And they're like, yeah, but who does that? So I think it's just as important to sort of build that, whether it's a RACI matrix or saying that, hey, if you're a system owner, these are your responsibilities. If you're a developer, this is what you're responsible for. So that way, when you have that, maybe that enterprise level tool, you can have the process to align with that so that people really understand expectations from that vulnerability management program.
Yeah, and on my front too, like, yeah, I mean, like, not to talk about product, usually I don't on these, but we just released a new feature, which is asset grouping based on access control. So I think one of the things is you have to get all your data in a centralized place, which is what Nucleus does of assets and vulnerabilities. But the next thing you have to figure out is who actually owns these things. And the reality is like, CMDB might solve for some of that, or an asset management tool, but like no one has a perfect inventory of all their assets, but there's a ton of metadata, right? And so part of that process is figuring out like, okay, who is actually responsible for these assets and how do we get visibility into those assets? And we see this a lot of times in the government side even as well, right? Where it's like all this information rolls up, but then it's like, okay, how do we get a hold of this person or this agency or this other part is some of the question of vulnerability management. But like first it's knowing who is actually responsible for it, right? And then if you can give them access so they can actually see for themselves, like they probably don't even know that they're vulnerable or how bad it actually is. So, just giving them in that context without shaming them. And then I do think that different organizations tend to have different approaches in regards to how they go about getting alignment and starting to meet SLAs. But I would say like start small and incremental. Like do things that are achievable in regards to trying to push out process to start and increment and reiterate. Because if you just say like, everything that's exploited vulnerability across the whole environment needs to be remediated in the next 30 days, like everyone will fail and they'll have no confidence in working on the problem. So I think, that's a big part of it is it's like increment and adjust accordingly and get alignment on what's realistic from a goals perspective and continue to monitor that and reiterate. So
yeah, I was just going to add a comment. I was laughing at Dino or Dino, however you pronounce the name. I'm sorry. They said sometimes you get the Spider-Man meme where you have three people kind of pointing the finger at one another, thinking that the other is responsible for the asset and or associated vulnerabilities. And I think that's spot on because, as we know, the first step is getting an inventory. And then, as you said, like finding out who's actually responsible for this asset and then ensuring that they even understand that they're responsible for it and they have to actually remediate the vulnerabilities on it. And then you talked about alignment. I think a lot of that alignment aspect comes back to leadership, organizational leadership, actually, kind of setting the tone that, we are going to prioritize addressing vulnerabilities and security more broadly. Because if not, you're going to struggle to get that alignment. You're going to be kind of, beating your drum about how things need to be addressed and how severe something is. But if they're not, if leadership's not behind that kind of messaging about addressing vulnerabilities in cybersecurity at the organizational level, it's going to be really hard to get that kind of support.
Hey, getting back to even in this process to like deciding what's the criteria, like one of the things I think about is recasting vulnerability severity is a big thing. So like, what is that? And this could be SSVC, this could just be recasting critical, high, medium, low. But that's something on the automation side as we're looking at second step is like, what actually really matters today that needs to get fixed? And how do you get that to the right people? So I think when we're talking about automation, it's like, well, yeah, you can use CVSS, but like if you have active threat intelligence that's telling you things are actively being exploited, things like KEV or EPSS or commercial threat intelligence, like you probably want to act on that stuff quicker and cast it as a much higher severity. And you might actually want to degrade the severity level of things, not degrade, but lower the severity level of things that don't have known any indicators of exploitation or have high risk of being exploited, right? So those are things that come to my mind as like we're looking at the different steps that you have outlined here that are relatively important as far as getting to a maturity in alignment across the organization on that.
Yeah, I think you're
Yeah.
you're spot on. I was real quick, Nikki, and then I'll throw it over to you. I was going to say I think you're spot on in terms of recasting things within the organizational context, as you point out. None of these systems are imperfect in the sense of EPSS and KEV. You found things that are known to be exploited that weren't on the KEV, for example. So none of these things are gospel. You need to kind of take all these signals into consideration, and then if you have intelligence beyond these sources that help you prioritize accordingly, as well as taking into account compensating controls or mitigating controls you might have in place in terms of being publicly reachable or behind certain security tools and things of that nature. So organizations definitely should be doing that, trying to drive down or not drive down, but realign the severity scores aligned with their particular environment and their particular threat.
Yeah, and I think just as important too, right, is there are going to be some vulnerabilities, some configurations that you accept as risk in your environment because you can't fix everything. There are going to be some configurations that will break functionality of systems, so you can't implement them. You can look at mitigating controls, but I think just as important, especially if you're using a vulnerability scanning tool or pick your vulnerability sort of process. But I think it's just as important to say, hey, we've accepted this vulnerability as a risk. We have it documented. Maybe here's our document ID or however you're cataloging that. But to remove that from the actual visualization of your vulnerability data. So that way you're not still looking at the same vulnerabilities over and over and over every day and saying like, wait, didn't we accept that risk? Wait, can someone find out? Can someone go look? So you remove that additional noise, right? Where we talk about like potential false positives or items that you accept as risk. So that way you can really hone in and focus on the items that really matter.
I love the concept of risk exception. That's like another big thing that people use Nucleus for, is tracking all of that. Because the reality is the network scanning tools continue to find the same things that are exceptions, right? Or like you find something that's a false positive. Like, how do you continue to damper that over time so it's not just continuing to create noise? And one of my projects that I want to work on is like, if anybody's interested, you should send me your risk acceptance. But I want to just create like a master list of all the possible risk acceptance and vulnerability management, because I think it would be really interesting to see like the reasons why people choose or make a decision to make a risk exception. Because I think like that's a really important process that I think doesn't get talked about enough and gets overlooked. And if you're not doing risk acceptance, well, you are. Like everyone is doing some form of risk acceptance. The question is like whether they're tracking or whether they know they're actually accepting risk, which I think are an unfortunate common scenario for a lot of organizations. What do you guys think of the risk acceptance list?
I was waiting for you to pause, but yeah, I think you're spot on in the sense that a lot of times in my experience, like risk acceptance is kind of implicit versus explicit. No one necessarily, explicitly says, yes, we accept this risk. They just kind of neglect to address the risk that's been presented to them. When you start to put people in a situation where, hey, here's the risk, we need you to assign on this saying that you are aware of it and you accept it, the conversation often changes to where now maybe they'll address the vulnerability or the security concern. So I think you're spot on in the sense that like trying to force that formal risk acceptance is a way to drive changes to addressing vulnerabilities or security concerns in a lot of experience I've had.
So, in wrapping up the modern vulnerability management program and building it, like what's your top advice you would give people as far as where to start, and then what does success look like?
Go ahead, Nikki.
Okay. Yeah, I'll take it. All right. So I would say to start is really just that an initial analysis, right? Like just take a step back, right? Don't keep trying to remediate everything all the time, right? Take a step back. Just have a meeting with who you think might be the most important people to have, right? Anyone who is a vulnerability management expert, anyone in the security program, anyone who is managing their own products, then you need to talk to them about like, hey, what's actually going on here? So you can sort of make that determination on what your individual next step should be. Because I would say if you're a small to medium-sized business, that's going to be very different than a larger organization that has maybe multiple products or things that they're managing, like different pipelines of business that they might be managing. They're going to handle that very differently. So I would say do that sort of initial analysis, build your problem statement, and then you can sort of work up from there. So that's really where I would say get started. And what was your second question? Your first one was that. What was your second question? Didn't you have two?
What's the end state look like?
Oh, end state. Yeah. So end state, I would say if end state is something that is built into, like, your vulnerability management program is not a separate program. It's just built into what people do, right? You're not talking about, hey, we need to have the separate process or the separate program or all these things. Like, continuous monitoring and vulnerability management should be something that's then built into what people are doing, right? It's just part of the expectation of the program. So I would say, not only are you able to knock down that backlog a little bit, right? That would be the end state would be to at least knock it down a bit, right? Get it sort of a handle on it. And I would say have that continuous monitoring plan in place. You'd have a pretty automated, comprehensive patch management process so that people aren't just patching things all the time. You've got an expected maintenance window. And so it's just sort of built into the culture in everything that you're doing. So, hey, once a week, we know we're going to be patching, we're going to be doing this and that. So to me, end state it just becomes part of your daily practice. And it isn't something that requires a ton of extra effort. It should be, vulnerability management should be easy. I know it's not, but it should be. So that's hopefully the end state.
Does anyone on this webinar think vulnerability management is easy?
It could be. It's possible.
It could be. It's great. I love it. So, hey, Chris, any additional things to add on that?
No, I mean, I think you guys covered it pretty well. I just, going back to some analogies around like fitness or finances, just taking that first step, we understand that we're drowning in massive vulnerability backlogs, just understanding where we are and where we're trying to go, and then start to flesh out kind of a comprehensive plan to get us there.
Yeah. I personally, it's like, I talk to a lot of people and like, I don't hear many people that aren't struggling with this right now, in relation to like, there's just a lot of vulnerability debt. I think generally speaking, until more recently, there wasn't mass exploitation like there is today. So we're just seeing kind of a knee-jerk reaction in relation to like, vulnerability management was neglected probably for a good portion of the last decade. Neglect is the wrong word, but more on the front of, just not invested in because it wasn't hit as heavily as it is getting hit now. Hey, on the last,
someone made a comment that vulnerabilities are tech debt, and I actually agree with that. And then, I agree with your point that like it's only going to get worse as we have more software, more systems, more vulnerabilities, more people interested in exploiting those systems for profit or other nefarious purposes. And this kind of gets at a point I know we're going to also touch on, which is like kind of stemming the flow here. Like, are we going to get ahead of this issue, or just kind of keep getting into this hamster wheel of patching, remediating vulnerabilities, and doing it over and over and over ad nauseum?
Yeah. So, hey, good transition. Like, I think the last topic we have is talking a little bit about secure by design, secure by default. And, I think like taking a step into like, we've been talking mostly about vulnerability management. I think when we're starting to talk about secure by design, secure by default, we're talking more about almost product development life cycles. Is that right? So do you want to give us a take on what secure by design and secure by default is?
Yeah, I mean, the conversation is like, it's not a new concept. It's, I actually wrote a blog about this a little while back, but if going all the way back to the Ware report, which is like 55 years old or whatever, it was written that we need to start integrating security into the system and product lifecycle, for example, like you point out. And what we've seen here is essentially like, they call it vulnerabilities tech debt. Software suppliers and vendors have essentially just been passing this tech debt downstream to consumers and customers rather than producing secure software and secure products. And of course, no system will be infallible. There'll always be vulnerabilities. But we've seen that basically like it's not being prioritized in alignment with, other things like speed to market or market share or revenue growth and profit. So until that's really addressed, we're just going to have this problem where insecure software and products keep getting pushed down to downstream consumers and customers. And then you have to have these massive comprehensive programs, which we just discussed for the last 5 minutes. So secure by design and secure by default is kind of shifting that paradigm and putting the burden on those best positioned to address it, which are the people making the products and software, to have them prioritize security as part of that system and software development lifecycle, so that they aren't just pushing out these insecure products that have insecure default configurations, or have vulnerabilities. They didn't use secure software development frameworks and processes, before they produce this product and push it out to the market. Let's try and get ahead of that, rather than this kind of hamster wheel of, patch, remediate vulnerabilities that we see now.
Yeah, and I think from the this idea of secure by design too. I think about the users and the developers, the people who are actually using this software, right? The people that are responsible for patching and maintenance and configuration. And when you have tools that require a lot of configuration, and someone may not be, a full expert in that, right? Like years ago when people started using AWS, and it was like they were misconfiguring S3 buckets to be open to the internet, and it was an accident, right? It was just a total misconfiguration. And so I think about secure by design as very much a human factors topic. It's an option to help the people who are managing software and systems to do it securely without them having to know how to do it securely. Because we can't expect everybody to be a cybersecurity expert or a vulnerability management expert. And so if we're able to develop products or design products that are secure by design, and you have to peel that security away, it's another option that they don't have to be an expert, and we can make security a little easier for them. And I think that's just my mission in security, is to try to make it easier for the people who are actually managing and consuming these tools.
Yeah, I think we see it all too often. I mean, being on the side of deploying security products for decades, I think all too often I've seen products deployed in insecure fashion. Even like at Duo Security, we developed the bypass code for us because they wouldn't buy the product unless the CEO could bypass two-factor, right? Now that was a decade ago, but the reality is like a lot of times there's no warnings, there's no information to say what are the actual consequences when you change these settings, or the settings start off by default insecure. And so I'm pretty passionate about like like we have to have this stuff be a lot more dummy proof. Maybe we need the bells to ring right when you're about to not wear your seatbelt when you're driving 100 miles an hour down the road. And so more and more I think there's a combination of like helping people implement best practices and then changing so you can't do poorly configured things that put you at large risk. So that's great insight. Hey, so I think Chris, on the CISA side, like you're working, I think they just published the secure by design, secure by default paper. I haven't read it yet, but just curious if you have any take on, the approach CISA is taking in trying to drive awareness and best practices here.
Yeah, I mean, first off, I'll caveat that, although I'm working with them, I don't speak on behalf of CISA. These are just my personal opinions. But they go into great detail about, both secure by design and secure by default tactics that we can have adopted within the industry by software suppliers and vendors. Like you talked about, it could be things like, shipping, instead of like, they're trying to flip the paradigm. We've all heard of hardening guides, right? We get a product or software, we got to harden it. Instead of having that, you have a loosening guide. It comes secure by default and secure, in terms of configuration and design. And then the customer or consumer can roll that back if they'd like. And then also having, like you talked about, maybe there's some features, just like a vehicle, if I'm going too fast or I'm not wearing my seatbelt, there's some kind of features that can also bring to my attention that, hey, you're doing something that's putting you at risk. Maybe you shouldn't do that. Or here, it brings it to the consumer's attention. And they're trying to push, like I said, the burden to the individuals or entities that can do something about it, which is the people making the software, making the products. Rather than kind of pushing that downstream to consumers. I know we're focused on enterprise cybersecurity here in this conversation, but there's a lot of consumers out there that don't know anything about cybersecurity. They have no, they're just buying a product at the store. They have no knowledge of what cybersecurity is,
They don't know how to update their router.
Yeah, they're just bringing this device into their home, and honestly, like they have no knowledge of cybersecurity, and that's why, like same thing with vehicles or food or any other industry. There needs to be some mechanism in place to ensure that we're producing things securely to begin with. And then we've seen some other efforts actually by NIST with cybersecurity labeling to help kind of empower consumers to, understand like the grade of a product from a security perspective before I buy it. That's a great, kind of think about a restaurant or food grading. It's a great way to kind of just quickly, hey, this is a C or this is an A. That can kind of help you make those purchasing decisions. So I definitely recommend diving into that paper. They go into everything in the paper around secure software development, segmentation, MFA, everything you could think of in security best practice context of, how suppliers or people producing products can go about doing securely and kind of mitigating some of the flow of vulnerabilities and exploitation that we see, from the myriad of, software is everywhere we turn. It runs everything in our society now. This is why we need to shift the paradigm to actually produce things securely from the onset.
The other document that I had to make sure I was not on mute. The other document that I really like they released was the misconfigurations, which ties back, a lot in regards to secure by design. Like many of the misconfigurations are just things that shouldn't be in products anymore. I do think there's some movement on there. Like, I think Windows announced in their new version of Windows, they won't have NTLM. Recommendations like SMB signing, default passwords. It's kind of comical that we have to continue to think about these things, but it is a real feat in a real reality. So it looks like we have about 5 more minutes. I think twofold. Any last tips for people building enterprise vulnerability management programs, and advice that you can give them before we wrap up?
Yeah, I will just very quickly. I think if you can take anything away from building a vulnerability management program or maturity models or things like that, I think the biggest point I wanted to make was around decision paralysis. It's a very real thing. It can be very difficult when you're staring at a massive backlog of vulnerabilities to sort of figure out what to do first. So I would highly encourage anyone that's interested in this or trying to mature their vulnerability management program to just pick somewhere to start. It might not be perfect. It might be need to be changed over time, and that's okay. But I always this is the way I approach things, right? Is it's like build if you got to build a 1-page process, hey, this is my vulnerability management program wish list, right? 1-pager, and then you can take it and build it from there and figure out what works and what doesn't, because chances are, especially if you're really just trying to get a handle on it, some things might not work, and that's okay, right? It's just about iterating that process over time and saying like, hey, it's okay if it's not perfect. We'll go back and figure it out and make it better next time. So that's my probably my biggest tip.
Yeah, and I'll just, from my perspective, we talked about this on the other slide, but just understanding, kind of where you are from a maturity perspective of vulnerability management, taking a look at how you're doing prioritization and exploring alternatives. We talked about EPSS and KEV and things like that. And then honestly, working with some of the leaders in this space, whether it's a product, leader who's doing innovative vulnerability management as a platform and product, who can help you kind of navigate this space and make sense of things and be more efficient and effective, or, expertise who can come in and kind of do an assessment of how you're handling this and where you can make some improvements and drive efficiencies to drive down risk for the organization.
Well, awesome. This has been good. I think we talked through the human element factor, alignment across the organizations, prioritization, VM program, and secure by design. So greatly appreciate both of you coming on to have a discussion today. Sorry, I'm playing clicky pen. I did want to highlight to everyone on the webinar, you two have a book available on Amazon. I think if you look up Modern Vulnerability Management or Effective Vulnerability Management, you can find it on Amazon and pre-order it. When's the book supposed to be out?
It's May 2024. So we got a little bit here, but we are cranking away on the writing, and then it goes into, kind of post-production, editing, reviewing, and publication process.
Sweet. My pre-order's in. So just want to highlight everyone, you can go to Amazon and pre-order this today. And then the last thing I want to leave everyone is next month, we're going to have a webinar or roundtable focused on collaborating with product security and vulnerability management. So we talked a little bit about some of that today, but we're going to look at it from a product security team specific perspective. Scott Kufer, COO, is going to join. Co-founder and CEO, I gotta make sure I say that, is going to join us to talk about that. We have a surprise expert guest, likely in the medical device industry, and then Matt Clapham, who's Senior Director of Product Security at Microsoft Activision Blizzard, which is cool. So I think seeing different perspectives from like both the medical device side as well as the gaming side, and I think it's really interesting, like a lot of exploits from my understanding and historically have actually come out of the gaming industry because like gamers are trying to get a competitive edge. Maybe not a ton, but I think there's some aspect of creativity there. I think Log4j might loosely be associated with Minecraft, for instance. So kind of interesting. It'll be cool to talk, but yeah, want to thank both of you. If anyone wants to scan that, you can register for the next webinar. But I greatly appreciate both of you taking the time to talk about how to build an enterprise vulnerability management program. And as always, look forward to continuing to collaborate with both of you. So thanks so much for the time today.
Definitely anytime. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks,
All right.
Patrick.
Take care.